Welcome to the latest in our Talking Book series. This is Harry Littman. Today we are discussing an important new contribution to the literature on disinformation and social media, and with a focus on its threat to fair American elections. And to do so, we're really pleased to welcome Professor Rick Hasen. He is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, and is co-director of the Fair Elections and Free Speech Center at UC Irvine Law School. And he'll shortly be moving, we'll be colleagues, to the UCLA Law School. Rick is a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance, and his previous books include The Voting Wars, Plutocrats United, The Justice of Contradictions, and Election Meltdown. He's been named one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America by the National Law Journal and one of the top 100 lawyers in California. Rick, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss your new book. I'll hold it up here, Cheap Speech.
It's so great to be with you. Thanks so much.
All right, let's start with the title. So it's a term that was famously coined by your colleague to be and mine, Eugene Volokh, some 25 years ago, and maybe it's sort of morphed a bit since. Let's just start there. Can you, for purposes of the book, how do you define cheap speech and what makes it so problematic?
So you're right that the term originates with Professor Volokh's article in the Yale Law Journal in 1995, Cheap Speech and What It Will Do. And what he was doing in that article was talking about the upcoming information revolution that we were about to undergo. He was very prescient in seeing things like the rise of apps like Netflix and Spotify, and how the role of intermediaries was going to change. That is, in the past, if you didn't like what you saw in the New York Times, your local newspaper, you could write a letter to the editor. And if you're very lucky, it would get published. If not, you could shout into the wind and not many people would hear you. And today, anyone can post on Facebook or Twitter or make a video on TikTok, any thoughts that they have. And, you know, the limits on that distribution is just how influential your arguments are. And so it was a very positive view. And Eugene expressed optimism that even without intermediaries, we'd all be able to make good choices. And so cheap speech in this sense is inexpensive speech.
To distribute.
Cheap to make and cheap to distribute. I mean cheap speech in that way, and I do not want to discount those. Those are great benefits. We literally have the knowledge of the world in the palms of our hands. When we take out our smartphones, you can find out anything. You can share any thought. Sometimes we share thoughts that we shouldn't share, but you can share whatever you like. So all that is very positive, but there's a dark side too when it comes to how our elections are being run, which is that voters rely upon intermediaries to be able to tell what information is truthful and what is not. So in the past there was, to use the classic example, Walter Cronkite. We could all tune into the CBS Evening News, and he would tell us that's the way it is, and he was credible, and we believed him. Today, it is still very expensive to produce quality journalism, to figure out what's actually going on, to do an investigation. But the economic model for journalism has collapsed, especially on the local level, as classified advertising and then other advertising left to go to Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, Google, Facebook, right? Newspapers no longer could produce at the same level. One major newspaper in the Midwest went from 100 reporters covering state and local news to 3. And so at the same time that it's still expensive to produce this good information that voters rely upon to make good choices, and at the same time that the economic model has collapsed, it's become increasingly inexpensive to make bad information. So you could create a website today that's full of disinformation. It could look superficially as good as your local newspaper's website, but it could be filled with falsehoods, or falsehoods could be sprinkled in through it. And voters have a harder time knowing what's true and what's false, because we're in this cheap speech era where you can just produce garbage and distribute it and make it look pretty And the fact that voters can't distinguish between good information and bad information means that they're going to discount all information and they're going to be less likely to pay for good information. So we have a kind of market failure when it comes to good information.
Yeah, now, so that last point is really interesting to me. I think that's connected with your use of the lemon metaphor, as you say. Maybe we can move to it, but Eugene was prescient in a way, but very, I think, upbeat, and his utopian vision has arguably become more dystopian. Um, Let me just stick for a moment with the fall of local newspapers, which you tie to the problem, because it's not simply that intermediaries or non-intermediaries can be trusted, but there just are fewer intermediaries in a way, with the near extinction of the local newspaper, which I think, especially for elections, had been the kind of go-to source for so many citizens to decide how to vote.
Yeah, well, we know that voters tend to trust local news
Mm.
more than they trust national news. And, we talk about the nationalization of politics. This is one of the problems. The New York Times is bigger than it's ever been. It does cover lots of national scenes. But on the local scene, we've seen the rise of literal fake news, that is, propaganda outfits that are sometimes backed by um, conservatives or backed by Democrats, or in one case I describe in the book, backed by the Russian government. They'll have some local news, but it'll have a definite slant to it. It could also contain false information, but it's essentially propaganda masquerading as local news. And so then, voters just are not getting the source of information they need, and this leads to lots of problems. One of them is, without good investigative journalism, it's hard to hold our elected officials accountable, right? So when you think about all the big stories that break, you think about, a campaign finance scandal in a city, or, some bribery going on. It's usually the local newspaper that is breaking that story by doing a lot of investigation, connecting the dots. And when people aren't doing that, we just don't know what our government officials are doing and whether we can trust them.
Yeah, I mean, that's how so many local papers kind of made their reputation. You point out in the book that Americans who follow local news closely are more likely to vote in local elections and to feel attached to their communities. So that just seems like a whole I mean, it's different from another point that you make, that people gladly sort of burrow into individual silos that they know might have disinformation, that for one reason or another they embrace. But these are people essentially being, duped, because I guess one problem is that the people who are putting it out don't have any kind of institutional need for credibility. That's not what they're about. You point out another real problem. It's not what so the local papers die because for a lack of advertising, among other things, and yet the disinformation industry actually has a sort of replacement, a sinister replacement, in the form of advertisement micro-targeting. Can you explain a little bit about that and the connection between it and democracy, or problems with democracy?
Well, let's take a step back and talk about,
Yeah.
what does it mean when we have a system where voters are no longer getting the information that they need, and also, and this is a key aspect to current society, we're living in a time of very deep polarization,
Yeah.
polarization, political polarization that arose well before the rise of social media, but that has been exacerbated by social media and by the current media environment. So we end up with, and you referenced this earlier, the lemons market.
Yeah.
We end up with a situation where not only is the information market not working well because voters will pay less for uh, quality news because they can't tell what's quality news, but we're also in a situation where some people demand false information. That is, it's not just a supply problem, it's a demand problem. And so when Donald Trump tells people that the 2020 election was stolen and that he's actually the winner and that his views are the ones that should have prevailed in the election, that is a message that resonates with people who want to hear this good news. And so
Yeah.
they'd rather believe that the election was stolen than believe the true fact that the election was not stolen. And so there ends up being a kind of cycle where there's demand for this false information, it's supplied, and this supply you mentioned for nefarious purposes. I think there are both political reasons and financial reasons as to why this kind of misinformation and disinformation is created. So, if you go onto YouTube and you click on a video about some false information, there's going to be advertising sold on that. And if you like it, YouTube, which is owned by Google, is going to offer you similar kinds of content, maybe even more extreme content. And so you're going to go further down that rabbit hole, which you mentioned earlier. And in the meantime, people are making money. I'm sure you remember, we both wrote about this on Twitter at the time. When Donald Trump was trying to fight the results of the 2020 election, he engaged in fundraising where he said, give to my recount fund and, help me defeat Joe Biden. And if you looked at the fine print, at one point, 90% of the money that you were giving to Donald Trump was not going to his recount fund or his legal fund. It was actually going to a separate independent PAC that ended up collecting hundreds of millions of dollars. Today, we call it a leadership PAC. It essentially can be used as a slush fund. And Donald Trump can pay lots and lots of his expenses whenever he goes on political trips out of this. He has a good financial motivation, aside from a political motivation, to continue to spread these false claims about the election being stolen. And he's got a willing audience. They're willing to fork over money to support this because it makes them feel better about the state of the world in our polarized environment. So it's a really vicious cycle. And the end result is that millions of people now believe the false claim that the election was stolen. We're going to go into another election where some people might be elected to office who've embraced these false claims. And this is going to further deteriorate public confidence in the fairness of the election process, because the people who are going to be running elections are going to be people who are going to be saying the last election was stolen. So it's just it creates a very bad environment in a democracy where we expect that the losers are going to accept the results as legitimate and reorganize and fight for a better result the next time.
Yeah, I mean, you point out that cheap speech isn't the cause here, but definitely an exacerbating factor. And it does seem to me, this isn't exactly what you cover in the book, but it's noteworthy and a little stomach turning that the biggest bounties financially for people on in disinformation society are exactly the ones who depart most brazenly from the truth. So every time Marjorie Taylor Greene says something outrageous, and of course the liberal press and everyone with any sense reacts by with outrage and shaking their fists, you learn that was another ka-ching $100 million for her, because it's specifically, once your audience is the people who want to hear that, it's just what used to be the kind of calling card of credibility has now changed into the calling card of, however you'd put it, sort of emotional upset or striking a blow against the political opponents, and that's a kind of intransigent situation. All right, so kind of bleak, and let me, before going to your kind of panoply of solutions, let's talk about how fast it's getting bleaker. You touched on this at the end of the book, but what's your assessment of, are we talking about geometric growth, short, steady growth? How much, as the, Trumps of the world figure out how to make money from it, or polarization increases for whatever reason, how much is the problem growing over, say, every election cycle?
Well, so I think we need to differentiate between the slow accretion of disinformation that we've seen over the last few elections. This is something that is not particular to Donald Trump. It's a general phenomenon that we see, and it does cause the kinds of problems that we talked about in terms of voters having a harder time telling what's true and what's false. I want to contrast that with lies specifically about the election being stolen in 2020, because I think this has kind of jump-started the crisis, right? So it's one thing to have a drip, 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 slow accretion of a problem, and then all of a sudden you realize you've got a problem you've got to take care of. It's another thing when you've got a flood that comes in all of a sudden. And I think this, right now we're in a flood situation and we have to, we're worrying about it receding. So what do I mean by this? I mean, when you've got 59% of Republican voters, according to a recent CNN poll, saying that believing that Donald Trump had the election stolen from him is what it means to be a Republican, you're in a situation of an existential crisis in election integrity in the United States. It means that there are going to be people in 2024 who are going to be primed to be willing to accept stealing of the election back as a kind of tit for tat. And I have a piece coming out very soon in the Harvard Law Review Forum where I'm talking about the different paths that the 2024 election could be subverted, including by state legislatures coming in and doing what Trump tried to do last time, which is overturn the will of the people by coming up with a second slate of electors. And, we can get into the details about how all that will work. But the point is that in a system of credibility, in a system of truth, it is basically impossible to try to steal an election in this way. But if you have people believing these claims of fraud and that the last election was stolen, they might take some desperate measures to try to steal it back. And in fact, they might see themselves as being the ones that are protecting democracy when in fact
Yes.
they're undermining it. So, if we didn't have this Trump phenomenon now, I think the discussion we'd be having is, it's dripping. Soon we're going to have to repair because we're going to have an overflow of problem, to now we're facing a flood. We've got to build a dam right now because our democracy is in existential crisis. And that's where I see us right now. I wrote a book in 2020 called Election Meltdown. People thought I was being alarmist, and I actually think I was being a little too optimistic in that book about where we are. And so this follow-up book, Cheap Speech, is about the current urgent threat that we face to election integrity in the United States coming from false claims about how the election is stolen, and the fact that there aren't a lot of good tools to try to deal with this kind of problem that are consistent with our commitment to free speech and fair elections.
Which we'll get to, and also, of course, tools to augment the problem are being passed in different legislatures as we speak. I have to say, I don't think you're being alarmist, but I'm one of many who, after the cataclysm of January 6th, thought, well, okay, what a bullet we dodged, and we could really see it, but at least that's it. And that since then, in fact, you can see taking form, out there, a replay, but smarter, and avoiding certain of the mistakes that the insurrectionists made is really harrowing. All right, so let's try to. Well, actually, let me ask you one. You do not talk about this in the book, Rick, and feel free to say it's not my department. But do you feel that as part of the dam, this is a very wide in wide currency today, that do you have an opinion on whether there need be some criminal prosecution and accountability for the political officials, Trump and his circle, from January 6th?
I certainly think that as Judge Carter found in the recent ruling, he was applying a lower standard of proof than you'd need in a criminal trial. He was applying a preponderance standard, but he found that it's more likely than not that Trump and Eastman, and I think he implied others, engaged in a criminal conspiracy to attempt to subvert the election results in violation of a number of federal laws. And I certainly hope that the Justice Department is taking seriously the potential for bringing criminal claims. I understand it's a politically fraught decision, but I also think it's politically fraught and legal. It's maybe legal cowardice to not seriously consider criminal charges. We're going to be in a political crisis one way or the other. we might as well try and hold people to account. And I don't think that the public hearings that the January 6th House Committee is going to hold in our polarized environment is going to move the needle very much on public opinion. I think criminal prosecution definitely should be on the table. I can't prejudge what the outcome would be. Some of it turns on the state of mind of people like Donald Trump, and you put that to a jury. I don't know what happens, but I certainly hope that it's being seriously considered in the
Well,
Justice Department.
let me push back even harder, because I think it is being seriously considered, and I think, or will be. Maybe they're being quite methodical to many people's chagrin. But I don't think it's really an evidentiary problem, including on the intent and state of mind. But it is a broader political small p problem, you could say, of just whether it's overall to the benefit of the country. I think that it's those kinds of considerations that are going to drive Garland, and probably in conjunction with Biden. So there's the position that I think I'm coming to slowly, that like the worst thing possible to do now is to prosecute Trump, except with one exception, and that's not to prosecute him.
Mhm.
So and I just wondered if you had a firm view of, because that obviously you've talked about an accretion and a drip that suddenly really exploded, and if you're looking at sort of an explosive response, that seems to nothing more explosive than a U.S. versus Donald Trump. So. All right, we'll leave that for us all to ponder, because your focus is on disinformation and in the election cycle. As you've just said, Rick, there much of what you're dealing with runs into at least possible issues or potholes in the current both political and cultural landscapes, and the First Amendment in particular. But let me start at a broader point. I think you make a really excellent argument that the typical, and you might have looked to, this is really sort of where Eugene was in 1995. The typical response to disinformation, to bad speech, is more speech and the robust marketplace of ideas. That just doesn't seem to do the trick, right? And do you agree, and why not?
Well, yes, I agree that the marketplace of ideas metaphor, if it ever accurately described politics in the United States, doesn't describe politics today. We don't expect that the truth is necessarily going to rise to the top. If it did, then you wouldn't have had millions of people believing and continuing to believe that the 2020 election was stolen, which is the example I keep coming back to in the book. It's kind of like when I should say, when I first wrote the book, I had a first draft before January 6th. And I had to rewrite the whole book, because what I was doing was predicting what could happen, and in fact, now we know what actually did happen is pretty darn terrible, right? So we're in a situation, where things look bleak, and the truth doesn't rise to the top. But that doesn't mean the solution is censorship. And it's very interesting that lots of people who've criticized my book, including Fox News and the Daily Mail and some commentators on Twitter, say, Hasen supports censorship because I'm criticizing the marketplace of ideas. And in fact, I don't. With two very narrow exceptions in my book, I don't call for limiting speech as the solution. And I'll say what the two narrow exceptions are. They're both exceptions that have been recognized by the Supreme Court. One is about foreign spending in elections, which the Supreme Court, in a case called Blumen versus Federal Election Commission, agreed could be constitutionally limited under the First Amendment because of our compelling interest in self-governance. And the other is lies about when, where, and how people vote. So if you tell people Democrats vote on Tuesday, Republicans vote on Wednesday, that's an empirically verifiable false statement, and people can be prosecuted for it. Like they can be prosecuted for fraud or perjury or something like that. So there should be a high bar to bring those prosecutions, but they should be allowed. In a 2018 case called Mansky, the Supreme Court in dicta, that is, it wasn't a holding, but a strong suggestion from the court, those laws are constitutional. But everything else that I propose is not about limiting speech. It's in fact enhancing speech. right? So just take one example. One of the things that technology is bringing us are so-called deep fakes. These are videos or audio files that are altered using artificial intelligence technology to make it look like someone is saying or doing something that they're not. And so you can easily imagine a deep fake that shows a politician saying a racial epithet or in a sexually compromised position or having a heart attack the day before the election. And so, what should we do about this? How can we help voters tell truth from fiction? I don't advocate for a law that would ban such videos. California has a kind of temporary law that says that you have to label these as manipulated unless they're satire. I don't think a satire exception is something that we want a government official to be deciding what's satire. But what I say is all of these videos should be labeled as altered. That is, we should use technology to require social media companies, if they're going to post, or TV companies for that matter, if they're going to post a video that's been altered in certain ways, that they're labeled that way. That way, when a voter is looking at something, they know if they can believe their eyes or not. And so I think those kinds of solutions that actually provide voters with more information, that help correct the market failure that I've been talking about, are the best solutions on the legal side to try to deal with these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I mean, you point out, Rick, the perils of leaving it to political officials to draw these lines and just imagine. Among the things that seemingly were unimaginable before 8 years ago or so is the prospect of a Trump political appointee determining whether something's on, the kosher or non-kosher side of the line. All right. So if in general you want to shy away from those determinations by political officials, and the marketplace of ideas is generally not up to the job, how can we basically try to is there a sort of overall one size fits all approach for trying to police speech that threatens democracy, or do you need to have a kind of piecemeal to approach to different kinds of disinformation?
Well, we're balancing a lot of different considerations, and there are different manifestations of the problems that come from cheap speech. So, therefore, in the third and fourth part of the book, I talk about
Yeah.
both solutions that we could legislate as well as social political solutions that are not legislation but are things we could do as a society to try to deal with the problem. So I mentioned already one of the legal solutions that I propose, which is labeling deep fakes as altered. I have other solutions like improving the disclosure laws that apply. Right now, if you get a campaign ad that's served to you on your TV and it came to you through a cable box, it's subject to disclosure. But if it comes to you through Hulu or through YouTube TV, because it's coming through the internet, it's not. I mean, it's a nonsensical system. So there's stuff like that that we can fix. I have certain
But
privacy.
what about the social approaches generally? I wanted to go to that side of things.
Yeah. So aside from the legal approaches, I think we need approaches as a society. So let me talk about one which I think is very doable and I think would help a lot. We talked about this decline in journalism, and how voters have a harder time telling what's fake news and what's something that can be relied upon. So imagine if a journalistic association said, all right, we've got a certain set of criteria as to what counts as good journalism. You have to have two sources before you make a factual claim. You've got to go to the person you're speaking about to give them a chance to respond and take their response seriously. And so they come up with these criteria, and then they decide to give the kind of good housekeeping seal of approval to certain journalistic outfits. So Los Angeles Times, they abide by these, they get the seal of approval. And then if somebody complains about them, it can be investigated. And it's all voluntary. The government's not mandating any of this. But so then certain journalistic outfits get the seal of approval. And then that seal of approval can appear on social media. So where the blue check mark is on Twitter or where the name is on Facebook, right next to it, there could be the little check that this is, doesn't necessarily mean it's true, because journalistic outlets make mistakes, but it means that they're doing their best and they're abiding by certain norms. And you can imagine, say, fights over whether Breitbart gets to get the seal of approval or not, and that fight itself would be educated for the public as to how truthful are these organizations, right? They'd be fighting for this check mark. And then people can use that as a proxy to know, okay, here's something that is reliable, right? So those are the kinds of things I think we need to do, not government mandated. And I think there's a lot that the social media platforms can do voluntarily, pressured by their customers, pressured by their employees to do the right thing. The question about whether Donald Trump, who was kicked off of Facebook and Twitter, should be allowed back on. Facebook has to make that decision by January 7th, 2023, when his 2-year suspension is up. That decision, I don't think the government should decide whether or not he has to be included, although there are laws that have been passed in Florida and Texas that would mandate his return to the platform. Those laws are being challenged in court under the First Amendment. I think those laws are unconstitutional for reasons we could talk about. But that decision, I think, should be made by the social media companies, and people should pressure the social media companies to do the right thing here.
You mentioned Breitbart, and a sort of part of the debate, or the meta debate, is this claim, this grievance by conservatives in particular, that there is a liberal bias to the intermediaries and the kind of official institutions, and we need some of these ragtag alternatives to combat that. And I think it's a softball to say, who has been more guilty of disinformation in the last period. It is plainly on the right, I think. So let me just ask you, is that just an anomaly where we are in history? Why is it that the lion's share of the flagrantly false claims are on behalf of, right-wing political positions?
So I do discuss in Sheep Speech that there is an asymmetry. And I think that asymmetry in part comes down to what is politically beneficial. So if you're a Trumpy candidate, who do you attack? You attack the news media, the FBI, the opposition party, the judiciary, all of those truth-telling outfits. Because if you're trying to do things that are not kosher, to use your earlier term, you're pressuring the government of Ukraine to dig up dirt on Joe Biden or Hunter Biden, then when that's reported truthfully, that is not to your benefit. So I do think that politically there has been this asymmetry, and it's not accidental. But I don't think there's reason to believe that that asymmetry is going to persist. And in fact, we have had instances where there are false claims that flow very well on the left. And think of the Donald Trump PP tape, which was contained in the Steele dossier, and there is no credible evidence I've seen that it's true that Donald Trump was with prostitutes, and that there's an incriminating recording that the Kremlin is holding over Donald Trump. But millions of people believe that kind of statement. And I think there's been a kind of overcorrection on the part of media and news media to deal with problems of misinformation coming from the right. And so one example that I talk about in the book is the question of the coverage of Hunter Biden's laptop. So Hunter Biden apparently abandoned an old MacBook with a repair shop, and that laptop ended up in the hands of those who oppose
Rudy Giuliani.
Biden. Right. So we don't know how it eventually got to Rudy Giuliani, but it got there. Right. And the New York Post reported on it at a time when the veracity of the chain of custody was undetermined. Right. And so the other news media, the more reputable news media, didn't report on it, and Facebook and Twitter decided to either remove or demote New York Post content related to this. So people didn't know about it. And now, fast forward a year and a half later, both the New York Times and the Washington Post have done reporting based on the content of that laptop, because now we know that laptop likely contained some truthful sets of emails.
Yes, at least.
And so I think it was an overcorrection, as I say in the book, and I said this, the book came out before the New York Times and the Washington Post have started recognizing this as legitimate. So I was writing at a time when it was still uncertain. I said, unless you know that this is false, we have to put a thumb on the scale in terms of allowing the sharing of information. And even though the marketplace of ideas is quite flawed, it's also dangerous to have social media companies say, this content is too uncertain to be shared. Now, once you know something is demonstrably false, and the example I use in the book a lot is, again, the 2020 election being stolen. It was not stolen. At that point, a private company's decision to not allow those kind of claims to be spread, I think, is a legitimate one. But the Hunter Biden story was uncertain. It should not have been shut down in the middle of an election, and that's a kind of overcorrection. One response when I've been putting this out on the left is, but Hunter Biden's laptop is irrelevant to the job that Joe Biden is doing. But to me, that's besides the point. That's for voters to judge as to whether or not it's relevant or not to their decisions of who they're going to vote for.
By the way, apropos of nothing, but just a remarkable detail that I hadn't known until about a week ago, he does drop it off and signs for something that says Hunter Biden. The computer repairman is blind. And so, he doesn't, he can't say it's Hunter Biden or that he looks like it, but there's some signature on there. Anyway, that's one crazy story. And I think it is not, it's not finished yet. I wanted to ask about one more, just again, you have many kind of interesting points of attack here, Rick, and some I hadn't thought of, like the lemon metaphor. And here's another that really intrigued me, which was the possible role of antitrust law to help the disinformation problem. And we should try to tread lightly because it's an arcane subject. A lot of people, even lawyers, don't know very well. But can you give us your general sense of the role that antitrust law and doctrine could be playing here?
Sure, and I'm no antitrust expert either,
Right.
but let me just say
Yeah.
this. There was a time during the 2020 election when if you went on Instagram and you searched for Joe Biden, in addition to getting positive stories about Joe Biden, you got positive stories about Donald Trump. But if you searched for Donald Trump at the same time period, you got positive stories about Donald Trump, but nothing positive about Joe Biden. And this was described by Meta, the company that owns Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, as a glitch, technical glitch. But there's nothing in the law that would prevent a social media company from having that deliberate bias. And let's think of search instead of social media companies. Imagine that Google decides, we think that candidate A is going to be a good president and candidate B would be a bad president. So when people search for these candidates, we're going to bias our results. We're going to program our algorithm so that it will spit out positive information to try to swing the election. Under Citizens United, I think you can't limit corporate use of money to do this. And, there's nothing in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act or any other federal law that would stop this from happening. One of the legal suggestions I have is that if algorithms are being tweaked in this way, that has to be disclosed. But even putting that aside, what's the solution to that? Well, one solution might be that if people know that Google is biasing its search, that they'll just vote with their feet. They'll use another search engine. But the problem is that Google might be so dominant in the search market that people don't want to leave Google. They feel like they can't. They've got everything tied into, their search and their email and everything. So maybe the solution is break up Google. It's too big. And if you break up Google, then even if there's a particular company that is biased in search, there'll be a number of companies that you could use that are all viable companies. And so that kind of solution, just like I mentioned earlier, privacy-based solutions, these are ones that don't depend on the government regulating speech, like shut up, you can't do that, you have to be even-handed, you must say this, you can't say that. But they are ways of dealing with the information environment being problematic. And so imagine having 5 good search companies you can go to, and if one of them is biased, then it's easier to leave that company and go somewhere else. Or maybe you like the bias, and so you decide to go to the biased company, but at least you have competition, and hopefully you'd have competition that a company could say, we'll provide you with the most accurate results, and they'll be unbiased and fair.
If you're one of those increasingly effete Americans who are looking for accuracy of all things. All right, you end, I should take that back, but we'll leave it in. You end the book with a case for a broader digital literacy campaign for Americans. Give us a little bit of a sense of what that might look like.
Well, so one thing that's interesting is that there seem to be different problems among younger Americans and older Americans. Turns out that older Americans are much more likely to spread disinformation that they see online. They're much less discerning. And so for older Americans, I think they need to be taught, and I say this always when I speak to groups, think before you click, think before you share. If a story seems too good to be true, again, about your political opponents, it probably is. But for younger Americans, is a different problem, which is that they tend to discount everything and believe everything is false. And there, I think we need to give them the tools to be able to know when is something worth relying upon, so that they can say, all right, this appears in the Wall Street Journal. Is that something I can rely upon or not? And maybe it depends on whether it's on the Wall Street Journal editorial page or it's in the Wall Street Journal in the news part of the newspaper. So digital literacy, but back when my kids were in grade school, I remember it was like, never rely on Wikipedia because that's going to be unreliable. Turns out now Wikipedia is much more reliable than lots of other things you find on the internet. So we need to give voters and future voters the tools to be able to tell what's true. And some of that is hard given the information environment we're in. That's why I think we need to pass some laws to change things. But people need to be able to recognize, that might be a deep fake. They need to know enough to know that they can't necessarily believe their eyes when they see a video of a politician doing something.
The book is Cheap Speech. Can you see it here, by Rick Hasen? On top of everything else, I haven't mentioned this, but it's a very good read, and you've done us all the favor of keeping the discussion in about the first 2/3 of the book, and then there's really detailed notes in the back for people who want to dig deeper. But all in all, for such an important and at least in parts arcane subject, it's quite readable. So a very a really important achievement. Thanks very much for writing it and for being here on Talking Books to explain it.
Well, I really appreciated the chance to have this conversation and to answer these great questions.